Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Willem Frankenhuis. He is an associate professor of evolutionary psychobiology at the University of Amsterdam and a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security, and Law. And today we're going to talk about harsh and unpredictable environments and how people develop in there. So, Dr. Frankenhuis, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for reminding me.
So, what characterizes harsh and unpredictable environments? What counts as such?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So, as with many concepts in the field, there are different definitions out there, but the most widely used one, especially in the human field, is to define harshness as age-specific rates of morbidity and mortality. So like morbidity could be damage to the body, for example, and mortality speaks for itself. And then unpredictability is sometimes defined as, stochastic variation through space or time in these age-specific rates of morbidity and mortality. Now, in the human field, when people study harsh and unpredictable environments, they actually often do not directly measure morbidity or mortality. And so they are not directly measuring, the concepts that they are working with, but they are using proxies, so things that tend to be associated in most populations with morbidity and mortality. So, for example, exposures to violence, or low levels of resources.
Right. Just before we get into how people develop in these kinds of environments and perhaps the kinds of psychological abilities that they develop there, is there an expected human childhood, a typical way that children develop? And if so, what would it be and what kinds of implications would it have for how we understand and study childhood development?
Yeah, that's a great question that really goes to the core of many things I'm working on. And, for many fields in psychology and maybe even social science more generally, certainly also anthropology, for example, it's an important question what the types of experiences were that human children would have experienced over the course of our species evolution. And of course, there are some experiences that might have been universal, but then there will also have been variation across time and across populations in the types of experiences children would have had. And both of these things matter because they can provide insight into the kinds of developmental mechanisms that the human species has evolved, that all human children come equipped with in order to learn about their environment and developmentally adapt to their environment. And so the term expected childhood is actually a term that in sort of the evolutionary psychology field is not often used, but in the clinical psychology literature, it is often used. And there, people are interested in this notion because there is a theory in that field, and I will also express some skepticism towards that theory in a moment. There's a theory in that field that says that when children experience negative events that fall outside of the species typical range, they are more likely to develop psychopathology. And so an example that's often discussed in this context are children growing up in harsh orphanage situations, okay, where they have very restricted movement and very regimented care that is not very responsive to their needs. In some of these orphanages, of course, there's also a lot of variation in orphanages. And so there, I think, most or all people would agree that that's not the kind of context in which, the children would have encountered across human evolution. But then there are other contexts where it's really an empirical question, whether or not children would have experienced these type of contexts. And so in the clinical field, when children are exposed, for example, to violence or harsh parenting, let me just say upfront, like, of course, that's highly undesirable. It's not desirable that children are exposed to violence or to harsh parenting. But when they do, to what extent will children be able to develop kind of strategies and skills for navigating that difficult context? Okay, and so if you think these types of experiences are very, would have pretty much rarely or never occurred over the course of human evolution, then you might think that children would not have many tools in their toolkit to be able to develop strategies and skills for dealing with them. But if these kinds of contexts would have occurred over the course of human evolution, not always, but often enough to exert selection pressures on the developmental mechanisms of children, then you would be able to you would expect such strategies and skills. And if that's the case, it's interesting to then study what those strategies and skills might be, how children use them, how these strategies and skills might interfere with other contexts that are maybe safe and supportive, how to leverage these skills in ways that benefit them. But maybe we can get there later. But it's important for clinical psychology, when they are starting to invoke this notion of the expected childhood, to not rely on an intuitive notion of what the expected childhood might have been like, but to really leverage, many decades of data collection that other fields in this area have done. So anthropology, primatology, bioarchaeology, human history. And so I see the expected childhood really as a concept where there is a lot of scope for interdisciplinary synergy.
Yes, we'll certainly get into at least some of those topics later on in our conversation. Let me ask you now, what do we know about how repeated or chronic childhood adversity shapes social and cognitive abilities?
Yeah. So over the past decades, the effects of adversity, by which I mean prolonged exposure to intense stress. So, for example, growing up in a violent household or neighborhood, or being frequently exposed to low levels of resources, struggling to make your ends meet. The effects of this adversity has been studied mainly from the perspective of how they create struggles for people, and how these struggles can lead to lowered functioning in some domains of life. And so decades of research suggest that people who are exposed to adversity, on average, there will be large individual differences, but on average, tend to score lower on certain cognitive tests, including some of the tests related to school performance. And the inference that people then tend to make from this deficit perspective, which I will also critique a little bit in a moment, is that exposures to adversity kind of impair brain structure and function in ways that lower cognitive performance. Okay, and so the focus has been on how adversity impairs social and cognitive development. And so there are countless articles in many journals, highlighting for a particular population exposed to a particular adversity, performance on a certain kind of cognitive test is lowered. Now, I think this body of work is really important, but I also don't think it's the whole story. And so my goal is not to completely try to critique that whole body of work and say there's nothing in there. I do think these impairment processes can in some cases operate, but I think in some cases when people think they are documenting an impairment, they might actually not be documenting an impairment, but a strategy that people use in a harsh and unpredictable environment. So really it would be an adaptive response rather than an impairment. And I think there are also cases where people in harsh and unpredictable environments actually develop skills that are not documented by some of the tests that are typically used. So I think it's an empirical question to which extent, in any particular case, impairment processes are operating and developmental adaptation processes are operating. And I think the assumption has been too much that it's only these impairment processes. And so I would like the field to work towards a more balanced view that incorporates also developmental adaptation, and then makes differential predictions from both of these processes to see in which cases people develop strategies and skills, and in which cases really there would be an impairment.
Mm-hmm. And what specific kinds of social and cognitive abilities are relevant in the context of repeated or chronic childhood adversity? I mean, I think that in your work I read about attention, learning, memory, problem solving, and some other abilities like this. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So the way that we approach this, this perspective, is to ask the question, which type of adversity are particular individuals exposed to? So, for example, exposure to violence is quite different than growing up in a loving, non-violent family context, but with low levels or unpredictable levels of resources. And so I think it's important to not take what is sometimes called a cumulative stress approach. So a cumulative stress approach is an approach where you kind of count up the different stressors that people have in their lives, and then people use these to predict outcomes, like, for example, cognitive performance or a risk of psychopathology. So this cumulative approach does predict some of these outcomes, but that's not the focus in this line of work. Here we take what you might call a dimensional approach. And with this dimensional approach, you ask for particular types of adversity, what would be possible strategies and skills that an individual would need to navigate this particular challenge. And then you can develop hypotheses about these skills. So to make it concrete, a specific example, imagine that a child is growing up in a world that is changing very rapidly. So sometimes, suddenly there is a potential reward in the environment, but it's also gone quickly. Or suddenly out of nowhere, there might be a threat emerging, okay? And so a child that's in an environment like this, you could hypothesize, and this is also a thought that other researchers have proposed, so I don't want to take credit for it, but you might hypothesize that individuals would be more vigilant. And as a result, they might be good at picking up changes in their environment or rapidly updating their information state because they're in a world that's changing quickly. Whereas if you're in a world where, maybe you come home and your parents say, oh, why don't you go do your homework in your bedroom? It's stable, quiet, and then 2 hours from now, when you come down from your bedroom, there will be dinner. Dinner will be ready. Right. So now this child can really focus with sustained attention on this, learning this homework, whereas another child is in a much more dynamic context where many things are happening, including threats, but also opportunities. And that child would be potentially shifting their attention more, updating their working memory faster. And so you might imagine that children in those contexts would develop enhanced attention shifting or enhanced working memory updating, maybe particularly if they were in that type of context. Okay, so in some cases, it's not just the developmental exposures that matter, but also what is the context within which we test people's abilities.
Mm-hmm. And are there unique strengths and abilities that develop in response to high stress environments? And if so, what would these strengths and abilities be?
Yeah. So I like to distinguish between, strategies. And so those I see as decision-making and behavior that is tailored to the demands of adverse environments. and hidden talents. And those I consider enhanced cognitive abilities, enhanced in order to solve a challenge in an adverse environment. And I think there is good evidence for adaptive strategies in harsh and unpredictable environment. There's a body of research that has grown over the past decades in this area. There is mathematical theory that is used to also make predictions in some cases. The hidden talents approach is much more recent. It's an approach that is about 10 years old. Fewer researchers have worked on it. And so I think the evidence for hidden talents, for these enhanced cognitive abilities, is more limited. I do think there are interesting leads in the literature and interesting findings, and some findings have been replicated, but in other cases, the evidence is more mixed. So some studies do find it, others don't. Or, there's one study that has found it, but we don't know the extent to which the result replicates or generalizes. So I would say that, yes, there is evidence for strategies, and there's some evidence for hidden talents, but that approach, needs to be fleshed out more.
Since you've already mentioned hidden talents, could you explain what these hidden talents are?
Yeah, so hidden talents are cognitive abilities or cognitive processes that through a process of developmental adaptation have become strengthened or enhanced, in people who are exposed to a particular form of adversity. So a concrete example that I think makes it very clear, and this is actually a study that's been done already a few decades ago, before kind of people, were looking at these things from a hidden talents perspective. Children who grow up in very abusive households, they, in this particular study, when they were shown faces that were partially degraded. So imagine like a photo of an angry face or a happy face, and then there's like pixels overlaying on the picture. So it's kind of hard to see what's exactly the emotional expression. So children who were physically abused relative to a non-abused control group, they were more accurate at reading the angry face. This is a study that was led by Seth Pollack in 2002. And so why is this really interesting? It's very interesting because it's showing that these children from these abusive backgrounds who would on average, typically in most studies, perform lower on certain cognitive tests, they actually performed higher on this cognitive test, specifically in recognizing an angry emotional expression. And so that you could characterize as an enhancement in their ability to detect information in the environment. Now, I will say that not all studies find this. There's another finding in the literature, which is actually more common, and that's when people find what's called a hostile attribution bias. So when there's kind of imperfect information, like ambiguous information, like a degraded face, people who have had many negative experiences, for example, to violence, they might just be more likely to give a negative experience. But they would do that not only when the face is actually expressing anger, in which case they're accurately inferring it, but also if the face would be, for example, happy, right? And so if you're interpreting an ambiguous but actually happy face as angry, that's not being more accurate. That's sort of over attributing anger to the face. And so there's, on the one hand, enhanced accuracy in some cases, and that I would consider consistent with hidden talents. But if there is, basically bias towards a hostile attribution, that would not be considered a hidden talent.
So when it comes to enhanced emotion detection in unpredictable environments, and particularly when it is associated with danger, I mean, is there enhanced emotion detection in those kinds of environments? And if so, which kinds of emotions what are the kinds of emotions whose detection would be enhanced?
Yeah. So the finding I just described from 20 years ago, that was focused on threat and children who had been abused. But there is actually a body of research, and this body, I think, I have substantial trust in, because there are quite a large number of studies. There is quite a large number of studies, many of whom, or at least several of whom, have adopted kind of gold standard open science practices like pre-registration, or have used a registered report format. And that work is on empathic accuracy.
Mm.
And so it's inferring people's kind of internal emotional states. And but that work is not focusing on people who have been abused, but it's focusing on people who come from less favorable socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a different group. But one of the thoughts, and there are several theories about why this pattern occurs, but in I would say about 2/3 of the studies that have been done in this context, people who come from less favorable socioeconomic backgrounds score higher on empathic accuracy. Okay, and this is true both when they are shown static pictures of very subtle emotional expressions. So you'll see a picture of just the eyes of an individual, and then they are either looking angry, suspicious, sad, or wary or something. And those are sort of subtle differences. But people from less favorable socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to judge these more accurately in most studies. And there's also work on this with dynamic stimuli. So there you don't see just a slice of a face, but you actually see a person kind of talking and expressing an emotion. And so, it's not known exactly why this pattern occurs. There could be different reasons for this. It could be, for example, that people in less favorable socioeconomic conditions are more dependent on each other, right? So if you have all the resources in the world, in a way, you're less dependent on other people, because with the resources that you have, you can always, for example, if you need a ride to the airport, you can buy a taxi, or if your fridge breaks down, you can ask somebody else, or you can just buy a new fridge. But if you're more interdependent, if you have fewer resources, you might just need, you need each other more sometimes. And so then being attuned to other people's internal states could be, a favored response. And so through phenotypic plasticity, through developmental adjustments, it's possible that people from kind of less favorable socioeconomic backgrounds become more empathically accurate. What's, I think, not really known in this particular literature is to what extent is this shaped by sort of developmental experiences versus an individual's current state. Okay, so if you take someone who came from sort of well-resourced early environments, but now they're currently experiencing low resources, to what extent does that shift their ability versus is it more like a gradually developed trait over the course of development? But it is one of the examples where the empirical evidence, I think, is relatively convincing.
Mm-hmm. And when and how do people living in high stress environments develop strengths or become more psychologically vulnerable? I mean, when and how is it that one or the other happens?
Yeah, well, that's a big and a challenging question. It's a very important question, and in terms of kind of vulnerability, for example, to psychopathology, I will not say too much about that, because my expertise in that area is more limited. But I would say that if you zoom out, the more severely intenseful the stressful experiences are, the more distressing they are, the more prolonged these experiences are through time. Is it a week? Is it your whole life? And the more domains of your life in which you are experiencing these different stressors, the more likely people are to develop psychological vulnerabilities. Now, it's also true that actually sometimes people talk about this in a little bit of a deterministic way, but actually, in quite stressful environments, many people, and often the majority of people do not actually develop these vulnerabilities. But it is true that people in such environments are, on average, more likely to develop such vulnerabilities. Now, there are also factors that are sometimes called protective factors in the literature on resilience. And those protective factors are things that make it sort of less likely that somebody will develop these vulnerabilities despite being in these challenging circumstances. And one example of a protective factor for children is the presence of caring adults/role models in their environment. So imagine that there's a child and it's growing up in a family that's really struggling, and maybe the parents are struggling to find the time to really help their children with the challenges that they're facing, whether it be going to school safely or getting their homework solved. Imagine that there would then be an uncle or a neighbor that's very supportive of this child. That really makes it more likely that this child is going to not have these kinds of vulnerabilities play a role. But even people who do develop potentially these vulnerabilities, it could still be the case that they also have strengths that are unrecognized by perspectives that only focus on sort of deficits and vulnerabilities. So I think of these things as, in some cases, being mutually compatible.
Mm-hmm. Are there environments where impulsive behavior is adaptive?
Right. So, just like the expected childhood, but even more so with impulsivity, there are different definitions of this concept in the field. And so that matters because, impulsivity defined one way might be adaptive in context A, whereas impulsivity defined another way might be adaptive in context B. Or there are actually some definitions of impulsivity which a priori define it as a maladaptive behavior. So then it's never possible to say that it's adaptive, But I think so. It's possible to distinguish between information impulsivity and temporal impulsivity. And so information impulsivity is about how much information do I want to gather before making a decision. And so if I'm really thinking through the consequences of my actions and gathering information on the possible outcomes, then I'm not very information impulsive. Whereas if I very quickly make a decision without thinking through or without gathering information about the possible outcomes, that's impulsive. So think about like somebody who immediately they see a nice house, they just buy it right away if they can, but then suddenly they realize that there are consequences. And temporal impulsivity is more about the extent to which you prefer. So all or most people prefer sooner over later outcomes. But there's a lot of individual variation in how strong this preference for immediate outcomes is. And so temporal impulsivity is focused on, how much do people prefer the immediate outcome? And so let's focus on when would temporal impulsivity be adaptive? So maybe you are familiar with the marshmallow test. Is that something you've heard about? And so children are offered, one marshmallow now or two marshmallows later, maybe after 10 or 15 minutes. And so some children eat the marshmallow instantaneously, and then there are other children and they wait. And there are nice videos of this online. If you think this sounds fun, you can Google it, and you'll find also children who, for example, open up the marshmallow and take some of the inside and eat it, and then close it back and put it back, waiting for the researcher to come back so they get the second marshmallow. But they have at least also had some immediate reward. Anyway. So when children grow up in a world where future rewards are much more uncertain than immediate rewards, maybe because their environment is changing quickly, or because they have little control over their environment, or about where they are in their environment, maybe they just are kind of moved around and they don't know whether they're going to be around. to cash in on the later reward. Maybe other people are either unwilling or unable to to give them the future reward. And so children who grow up in such environments are more likely to take the first marshmallow instead of wait for the later marshmallows. And in the literature, this was often characterized as sort of a failure to delay gratification, or short-sightedness, or an impairment in their inhibition, their ability to kind of inhibit their immediate urge to grab this first marshmallow. But other researchers, including, for example, Martin Daly and others, they argued that in a world where future rewards are unlikely to materialize, it might actually be adaptive for an organism to take the much more certain immediate reward. And so if you ask me, what are the conditions in which impulsivity might be adaptive, those conditions, it matters in part based on how likely the future reward is. And there's also mathematical modeling that has, analyzed this problem, and that supports also, this hypothesis. And so it matters because this is a case, remember at the beginning, I mentioned that there are some cases where people characterize something as an impairment, but actually, it's possible to view it or to reframe it as an adaptive strategy. So if it's true that a child is growing up in a world where future rewards are unlikely to materialize, and it's showing, a stronger preference for these immediate rewards, rather than saying, oh, this child has a deficit, it might be more accurate to say this child is responding adaptively in just the same way that any other or most other individuals would had they grown up in this context. And what's really striking, and there's some very interesting work on this, among others by Celeste Kidd and Yuko Munakata and Laura Michelson, where they have shown that the extent to which children wait for this second marshmallow, it depends also on the extent to which they trust the extent to which, for example, an adult is going to give that later reward. Okay, so in one set of studies, what's been manipulated is whether the child, in a previous interaction, the adult actually lived up to their promise towards the child, and if they didn't, the child thinks, oh, this adult is maybe not so reliable. I'm actually not going to wait for the second marshmallow. So children who do developmentally come from, on average, relatively reliable environments, they kind of quickly adjust their behavioral strategy when the experimenter might not be reliable towards them. And in other set of studies, the adult was behaving unreliably towards another adult rather than to the child itself. But then the child, noticed this and was like, okay, well, in that case, I'm less likely to wait for my future reward. Yeah.
Right. So I think this is sort of related to the previous question. In what kinds of contexts do people develop a present-oriented psychology?
Yeah, I agree that is related, because so a present-oriented psychology we could characterize as a psychology that's prioritizing the present over the future in general, and so that includes potentially like immediate rewards over future rewards, but also it might, for example, be the case that the organism is very attuned to threats that might be currently present. So then you're also focused on the present, on rapidly updating information now, and maybe, using cognition to do that, maybe more than sort of focusing, storing things into long-term memory, which is a more future-oriented thing in some sense. And so, it's a complicated question, but from a bird's eye view, I'd say in environments that are that are changing rapidly. One of the tricky bits is that change can take different forms. So environments might change in a way where the current state of the world does predict next states of the world. So, for example, if today's weather predicts tomorrow's weather, we would say that the state of the world is autocorrelated. There's a correlation from today with tomorrow. But change might also be what people might call stochastic, and so then tomorrow is not so predictable from today. Of course, this is a continuum, the extent to which there is autocorrelation, and it can differ for different dimensions of the environment. So it could be that, for example, threat is relatively highly autocorrelated, but resources are not, or vice versa. And so in general, and this is really one of the, I almost want to say sort of a soapbox that I like to get on, when we're studying developmental adaptations to childhood environments or environments in general, it's really, really crucial to characterize the environment in a very precise and fine-grained way. And so this is one of the things that I really like about like ecologists and evolutionary biologists, but also vision scientists, for example, in human cognition, is that they're interested in the adaptive fit between organisms and their environment. And they really try to characterize the environment in a lot of detail. And so that means, for example, not just saying, oh, there are high or low levels of threat, but also how does threat change through space and time? And, is it different for neighborhood threat versus, family threat? And, when you characterize the environment much more precisely, you can also develop more precise hypotheses about what would be the kind of cognitive strategy or behavioral strategy or skill that would benefit the individual in that context. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Why is there a high prevalence of violence in deprived communities?
Yeah. Well, I would first say that it's true in some countries that in deprived communities there are higher rates of violence than there are in more affluent communities. But there are also communities where resources are low, where violence is not necessarily more prevalent. And so when we think through these questions, it's important to acknowledge that variation, I think. But it is true that in some industrialized countries, this is the case, and the reasons for this are really multifactorial. Like there are many reasons for this. And sometimes those reasons are hard to tease apart, but I will focus maybe on one reason. In resource deprived communities, there are relatively many people who are struggling to make ends meet. Okay. And so, for example, they might not be able to, to feed their children that evening or buy clothes that they need for their children, or they cannot pay rent, and so they risk being evicted from their house, which has major downstream consequences. If you're evicted from your house, it might be much harder to sustain your job. If you don't sustain your job, your income, falls out, and maybe you end up in a homeless situation with a lot of threats, living on the street. So people are in sort of in a really difficult situation. And when people are, and sometimes a concept that Daniel Nettle and Benoit de Courson, for example, use for this is something like a desperation threshold below which people are not able to meet their basic needs. When you are below this threshold, it might be a reasonable response for an individual to try to engage in a high-risk behavior. And by a high-risk behavior, I mean a behavior that could lead them to actually have a very favorable outcome above this desperation threshold, even if it's also possible that it actually leads them to be in a worse position. Okay. So for example, if I choose a safe option, like a low-wage job, but that's not going to help me actually pay the rent anymore, and I will get evicted and I will run into all these problems, that low-wage job is not such an attractive option. If there's another option, which might involve violence, like robbery, that's a much more high risk option. Something really bad could happen for me, but it could also be the case that now I do have these resources that I need to pay rent, or in some cases, if people struggle with drug addiction, it might help them satisfy this sort of, for them, basic need of procuring the drugs. Now, let me just highlight that the vast majority of people in deprived communities do not engage in violence, but a subset of them, might use that as a strategy to obtain, resources that they need in order to get above this desperation threshold. Now, what's interesting about this desperation threshold idea is that it also predicts. So it doesn't just predict that below the threshold, maybe, in some cases, risk-taking is favored, including violence could be viewed as a form of risk-taking in some cases. But when you're above the threshold, you actually want to not take very many risks. You don't want variance in your outcomes, because variance in your outcomes could also mean you fall below the threshold. So then what this idea predicts is that when you're above the threshold, you actually are more risk averse. And so it predicts a discontinuity where if an individual feels like they're below the desperation threshold, then it increases the chances that they will take more risk. And more risk can be taken in different ways. You can also buy lottery tickets, which is non-violent, but for some people, it might mean using violence to try to obtain resources.
So earlier when we talked about hidden talents, this is something that you touched on a little bit. What is resilience and how do people develop it?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and actually my colleague and collaborator Bruce Ellis, I think he phrased this well in a paper we wrote together, because this is a question that's commonly asked when people are interested in hidden talents. They say, "Oh, is this the resilience approach, basically?" And the resilience approach, has been around for a few decades. A leading researcher in this area has been, for example, Ann Maston, and she's written a book, Ordinary Magic, which is explaining the approach. And the way that Bruce Ellis characterized it is as follows. So in the resilience literature, people ask, despite exposures to adversity, some individuals do achieve kind of favorable outcomes, like having, a stable income, having stable social relationships, not struggling with mental health or addictions, or not, and so they have particular outcomes despite the adversity they experienced. They beat the odds, whereas the hidden talents approach says not despite, but because of adversity, because of the exposures to certain kinds of adversity, people might develop skills that help them navigate this difficult challenge. So if you have low resources, for example, and you're more dependent on other individuals, maybe you develop enhancements in empathic accuracy. Now, this idea is also not specific to the hidden talents approach. There are researchers in kind of social and cognitive psychology that have developed these ideas as well, but it does fit with the hidden talents approach. And so here it's not despite of, but because of adversity, an individual has developed a particular outcome. There's another important related difference, and that is that the resilience approach tends to focus on outcomes that are socially kind of valued, that are considered socially desirable within society, within a particular society. But that's not necessarily true for the hidden talents approach. So, for example, if it's the case that I grow up in a social environment where status, is attained, or resources are obtained through coercion in part, okay, and so maybe through, intimidating other people, or making sure that they don't mess with me, okay. The ability to get people to think that they should not mess with me in that environment, the ability to maybe intimidate other people in that context, is a strategy that is benefiting potentially that individual, but it's not something that people, that would be generally considered socially desirable. But if people in that context, in some cases, develop enhancements in this ability, that would be considered a hidden talent. So I would say that the hidden talents approach does not necessarily focus on outcomes that are beneficial for society. It might, in some cases, people might, when you have a skill, it can be used for good or for bad in a societal sense. So if I'm better at, let's say reading other people, I could use it to help other people, but I could also use it to exploit other people, right? And so the skill here is what the focus is of the hidden talents approach. And then whether it's used in a socially desirable way or socially undesirable way is less important to the hidden talents approach. Although in this approach too, we're very interested in, when we characterize people's skills, how can we help them leverage these skills in ways that benefit them and that benefit also society?
Mm-hmm. So taking into account what we've been talking about in terms of how humans develop in different kinds of contexts, are there high degrees of phenotypic plasticity in humans, particularly when it comes to being able to tailor development to different conditions?
Right. So phenotypic plasticity, the ability of organisms to adjust their phenotypes in response to environmental conditions, or another definition that's sometimes used is sort of the capacity of a genotype to express or produce different phenotypes depending on environmental conditions, is widespread in nature. And so, most or all species exhibit phenotypic plasticity in some traits. Okay, mm-hmm. So an example of a phenotypically plastic trait would be the stress response system. If you grow up in a world that is safe and supportive and stable, and you have a lot of control over outcomes, your stress response system is going to, on average, develop differently than if you grow up in a world, where there's threats, there's unpredictability, you have little control over outcomes. And so there's plasticity in the stress response system. It's shaped through developmental processes in a particular way, on average. Now, there are also traits where we don't exhibit phenotypic plasticity. So, for example, the number of eyes in humans is not phenotypically plastic. If we grow up in a world where there's relatively low amounts of sunlight, it's not the case that we develop a third eye, for example, right? And so it's always important when asking about phenotypic plasticity to sort of say, okay, in which trait are we considering phenotypic plasticity? And then to sort of say, what are the types of inputs to which this trait can respond? Okay, and so humans are certainly in many traits a highly phenotypically plastic species. So some animals they can learn about some very specific thing, but they cannot. They can learn that a particular input is associated with a particular output. It's acquired through experiences, but they can't learn the breadth of information that humans can learn, right? And so humans can learn a very broad range of information. Now, it's not the case that animal learning always is, of course, just simple stimulus response. Like animals can also, in some cases, learn very complex and quite broad things, but humans are unusual in the extent, I think, to which we can do this. And that's not so. It's interesting because sometimes that's characterized as they have sort of, the other non-human animals have specific learning mechanisms and humans have general learning mechanisms. I don't really love this terminology because the various ways that humans can learn also require many different mechanisms, I think. And this is not just something that I'm saying. It's also, a point of view that's quite common in evolutionary psychology, that humans don't have less, but actually have more learning mechanisms. So, for example, humans can learn through teaching, right? So somebody who already knows how to solve a problem or make something, they might modify their behavior in a way that makes learning for other individuals, naive individuals, easier. Okay, now there's discussions about how much teaching occurs in different cultures and so on, but it's clear that humans can learn through teaching. And many other non-human animals do not learn through teaching. But teaching then gives us an additional mechanism through which we can acquire information, right? And so I am not an expert in culture, but what I glean from the literature is that most researchers think that cumulative culture, where we transmit cultural skills, cultural knowledge, and then develop innovations on this knowledge, and then transmit the revised cultural knowledge. And in that sense, we can incrementally increase the complexity of the tools we build, or of the languages we use, or of any kind of thing that helps us adapt to our environments. That cumulative culture is either unique to humans or almost unique to humans. And to my understanding in this literature, the consensus is also that it's cumulative culture that has enabled humans to inhabit such extremely diverse ecologies, right? So we live in freezing cold, very hot, with many forests, or with very barren landscapes. So we live in cities. We can live in all these types of environments. Because we are highly phenotypically plastic. We can adjust to a very wide range of conditions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So one last question or topic here. When it comes to development, I've seen, and also through some of the interviews I've done myself, that we can observe the use of life history theory, both in psychology and in evolutionary biology. But are psychologists and biologists using the term in the same way, and are the research programs similar or not?
Yeah. So there are similarities and differences. And so let me just highlight a couple of similarities. So there are similarities in some of the key concepts. So for example, the notion of trade-offs is central to both fields. And so there are different types of trade-offs, like resource trade-offs and functional trade-offs. But let me just for now say, the idea that if you use your resources to grow a larger body, for example, you do not have those resources available for maybe producing offspring quickly. That those kinds of trade-offs are central to both literatures. Another thing that's central to both literatures is a focus on life history traits. And so those are the traits that kind of define the life cycle of an organism. So, the age at which it matures, the number of offspring it produces, the investments it makes in offspring. And so those types of traits are also central to both approaches. So there is some common core, but they are sort of partially overlapping Venn diagrams. And now I'll mention some of the differences where the Venn diagrams are not overlapping. Well, so in the human literature, it's quite common for researchers to include what you might call kind of more psychological traits into what people think are life history strategies. So they will, for example, argue that people who mature fast and start reproducing at a young age, that's part of a life history strategy, sort of a suite of correlated responses to a particular environment. And that suite of responses also includes maybe risk-taking and impulsivity, to mention two of the traits that you asked about earlier. That's not the way it's typically talked about in the evolutionary biology literature. Okay, so this broader range of traits that's included in the human literature, that's one difference. And I think one of the challenges of this, is that and this is another difference, is that the theory in evolutionary biology on which life history, that framework is based, is often mathematically formalized. So people have expressed, in equations exactly what the variables are, how they are thought to relate to each other, computed under different scenarios what natural selection, would favor. And people have done this for these life history traits. Okay. Now, in the human literature, almost no one is doing this mathematical modeling. There are some exceptions, but it's very rare, this mathematical modeling in humans. And also the extent to which people draw on the mathematical modeling in the evolutionary biology literature is very limited in most cases. But then people do make claims about it would be adaptive for natural selection would favor in these types of scenarios, not just earlier reproduction, for example, but also higher risk taking and more impulsivity. But that claim is then not based on mathematical theory. And so an evolutionary biologist would question that. They would say, it could be empirically true that these things hang together in some or all human populations. And if that's the case, that's interesting, and that requires an explanation, and maybe it requires an evolutionary explanation, maybe another type of explanation. But it's not a prediction from life history theory insofar as we view life history theory as a formalized body of theory in the way that we're using it in evolutionary biology. And so, as a researcher also, on the one hand, I'm really enthusiastic about social scientists, including psychologists, building these bridges with life history theory. There's also a sophisticated literature in anthropology that's doing this, which I really appreciate. But I also think it's really important that the kind of social scientists keep a close eye on the formalized theory that's being developed in evolutionary biology, and that we are very explicit about when are we predicting something based on a mathematical model, or which mathematical model, or under which scenarios, versus, here we observe an empirical pattern that we think potentially, could be viewed in light of life history, in terms of life history theory. I'd like to say one more thing about that, if that's okay.
Yes, sure.
I think in evolutionary biology, people see life history theory more as a framework. And so what is the difference between a theory and a framework? This is a whole discussion in itself. But, you could say that, a theory allows for, especially if it's formalized, it allows for deducing predictions. Whereas a framework is more a description of what are the important concepts and which things are, related to each other. But how those relationships pan out, that could depend on the context. And so, for example, whereas a psychologist, it's common in the human literature that people will write something like, in a harsh and unpredictable environment, faster life history strategies are favored. And so, people reproduce at a younger age, and so on and so on. But actually, the mathematical modeling shows that actually depends, for example, at which ages this harshness causes the most mortality. Is that early in childhood, or is it more in adulthood? It depends on whether the population is currently, growing, or is currently sort of at carrying capacity in the ecology. And so in biology, you would not usually read some general statement like this. They would say, under these and these and these conditions, mathematical modeling suggests that it would be adaptive to have such and such life history strategy. And so it's possible to build within the life history framework specific theories that address particular scenarios, but it's not viewed as a theory that makes all these predictions in the way that the human field does. So I like that this bridge is being forged. I think it's great that there are these bridges between the social and biological sciences, but I do think there is, it's important for us to try to build these bridges as best we can.
Great. So just before we go, Dr. Frankenhuis, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah. So you can find my work, by typing it. There are sort of two websites where you can learn more about my work. One is my personal webpage, and so you could look at Willem Frankenhuis, and then you'll find it online. We talked earlier about adversity and about trying to develop an approach that is not just focusing on sort of the struggles and potential impairments, but also on strength and strategies and sort of a more well-rounded view. And I'm, of course, not the only researcher who is interested in developing such an approach. there are, in fact, there's really a growing number of researchers across different fields of psychology, but also beyond psychology, interested in doing this. And so with these researchers, we started a network, and that network is focused on science communication. Okay, because we think that the way that people growing up in conditions of adversity, the way they are represented in the scientific literature, but also in the media, is sometimes not doing justice to the full picture. And so, there's a network now which is about communicating and expanding research on adversity. It's the CERA network, CERA. And so if you're interested in reading about sort of the science communication aspect of how people grow up in adverse environments and how we can try to do a good job of representing them, in a way that does justice to the complexity of their lives and the nuances in their strategies and abilities, looking up this network website might be interesting. And there are also some products that we're developing with this network focused on this particular topic.
Mm-hmm. Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciated it as well. And I look forward to our future interactions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.